Good morning and welcome to the Commission's press room. Today is Thursday, the 5th of November, and we are here for an online press conference on the European Commission's autumn economic forecast. The forecast, as well as the related press material, has now been published and is available online. We have here with us Commissioner Paolo Gentiloni, who will give us a presentation of the forecast, and then we'll be ready to take your questions. Commissioner, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Let me, first of all, begin thanking DG ECFIN and my team for the effort, which is not an easy one to have solid forecasts in such a uncertain situation. We have 5 key messages emerging from the 200 pages of our forecast. First, the pandemic caused the deepest recession in EU history in the first half of 2020, surpassing that in the great financial crisis. This contraction, which was uneven among member states, was followed by a strong rebound in the third quarter, a very strong rebound, as containment measures were eased. Second message, in recent weeks, we are facing the resurgence of the pandemic and new containment measures have been taken. The economic rebound has been interrupted. Growth is set to stall in the fourth quarter and to pick up again as of the first quarter of 2021. Overall, EU GDP is forecast to contract by about 7.4%, 7.8% for the euro area this year, before growing 4.1%, 4.2% for the euro area in 2021, and 3% in 2022. These forecasts implies that GDP for the EU as a whole will be just shy of its pre-pandemic level by end of 2022. But unfortunately, this is not the case for all member states. Third, policy measures taken at national and EU level continue cushioning the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on both households and firms. Furthermore, a highly accommodative monetary policy has supported market funding as well as bank lending. To support confidence and the recovery, it is essential that monetary and fiscal policies continue to work hand in hand. Fourth, given the current exceptional uncertainty, we have made 2 important technical assumptions on the forecast. First, we assume that some degree of containment measures will remain in force throughout the forecast horizon. And this partially explains the slower path of recovery in 2021 and 2022. However, after a significant tightening in the fourth quarter of 2020, the stringency of the measures is expected to gradually ease in 2021. Second assumption, and without prejudice to the outcome of ongoing negotiation on a future EU-UK partnership, we assume that the EU and the UK will trade on WTO most favored nation rules from January 2021. Fifth message, downside risks are, in this forecast, exceptionally large. But there are also upside risks, and I will run through these at the end of my presentation. So, starting with a look at the international situation, the global GDP, excluding the EU, expected to contract by about 3.8% in 2020, considerably more than during the global financial crisis. It is forecast to rebound by around 4.7 in 2021 and to moderate to about 3.7 in 2022. Coming back to the EU, monthly data confirm that the economy has been on the mend as of May. Parts of industry, construction, and retail trade rebounded vigorously over the summer, driven by a strong pent-up demand. By contrast, services relying on close person-to-person contacts have remained weaker as containment measures have remained in place and also consumer behavior, affecting demand and supply for services involving such as travel, tourism, restaurants, entertainment. The flash estimate from Eurostat published last Friday indicates that the third quarter rebound was even stronger than we expected. The rebound was driven by pent-up demand, as I said, and decisive policy action both by member states and the EU. But as I've underlined, the resurgence of infections across Europe in recent weeks is causing renewed disruptions. This is expected to put the recovery on hold in the short term. It also leaves the outlook subject to extremely high uncertainty. The gradual decline in the level of stringency over the course of 2021 should translate into consumption and investment gradually rebounding. GDP is forecast to continue growing in 2022, but at a somewhat more subdued pace. In short, we never counted on a V-shaped recovery. Now we know for sure that we will not have one. The pandemic is evolving by the day, making any forecast subject to high uncertainty. We have therefore produced two alternative scenarios to complement our baseline forecast. The downside scenario considers the negative impact of economic sentiment and firm financing conditions of stricter and more protracted virus containment efforts. As you can see, this downside scenario projects significantly worse economic outcomes in the near term. By contrast, the upside scenario assumes an earlier and stronger recovery in business and consumers' confidence, resulting from faster progress in development of an effective treatment or a better adaptation by households and firms to the new COVID-19 environment. The depth of the recession in 2020 and the speed of the recovery in 2021 and 2022 are expected to vary widely across member states. Nearly half of our member states are not expected to recover their pre-pandemic level of GDP by the end of 2022. These divergences reflect the difference in the severity of the pandemic and the stringency of related containment measures. But they also reflect differences in domestic policy's response and economic structures. Namely, countries with large tourism sectors are expected to take longer to achieve a full recovery. Just as private consumption and investment took a particularly sharp hit in the first half of the year, both are expected to drive the recovery in 2021 and 2022. Private consumption is set to rebound as households gradually release accumulated savings and adjust their spending patterns. Investments is set for a gradual rebound over the next 2 years, benefiting from highly accommodative monetary policy, increased public investment and government support schemes for firms, the EU recovery package. Unlike in past recoveries, the European economy cannot count on a significant pull from the external side. as the pandemic has been a truly global shock. Net exports are not expected to contribute much to the EU growth over the next 2 years. So all member states have put in place sizable discretionary fiscal measures to cushion households and firms from the negative impact of the pandemic. The social impact should be a shared priority in member states and at EU level. In particular, short-time work schemes allow firms to keep workers on their payroll during temporary economic difficulties, thanks to compensation from the governments. SURE will now support these schemes in 17 member states. As a result, the euro area fiscal stance is set to be strongly expansionary in 2020. Other support policies for corporates without budgetary impact, state guarantees for bank loans and tax moratoria, have aimed to support liquidity and avoid bankruptcies. At the same time, the ECB's continuation of easing measures, mainly through asset purchases, combined with subdued inflation expectations, are assumed to keep real long and short-term interest rates negative. The policy mix appears exceptionally favorable, as it should be, and is expected to support the recovery. Thanks to ambitious policy measures in all member states, job losses during the first half of this year were much more contained than the drop in economic activity. But nonetheless, they are unprecedented. In addition, a significant amount of labor market slack has accumulated since March, reflecting the drop in hours worked as well as workers leaving the labor force. This is set to delay labor market improvements over the next 2 years. Moreover, employment may encounter further losses when short-term work schemes are discontinued. Reflecting these developments, the EU unemployment rate is expected to increase from 6.7 in 2019 to 7.7 this year and 8.6 next year. It is expected to decline in 2022 to 8%. Inflation recently turned negative due to a significant fall in energy prices and lower prices of services, especially tourism-related. In 2021, the assumed stabilization of oil prices will contribute positively to headline inflation. Core inflation, which captures all items except energy and unprocessed food, should pick up somewhat as activity resumes. Still, downward pressures are set to dominate price developments due to the weak demand, labor market slack, and strong euro. Overall, EU inflation should reach 0.6% this year and 1.3% next year. So our growth map in 2021. All our economies are expected to shrink this year and are also forecast to grow in 21 and 22. But as I said earlier, the depth of the recession and the speed of the recovery are expected to vary widely. Among the largest member states, only Germany and Poland are forecast to reach or surpass their pre-pandemic GDP levels by the end of 2022. Thanks to strong growth in the third quarter, Germany's GDP is set to contract by 5.6% this year. That's less than the euro area average and less than projected earlier. Further recovery in consumption, industry, and exports are expected to drive growth in 21 and 22. Still, the second wave of infection is expected to dampen the rebound in Germany next year to 3.5 and 2.6 in 22. In France, the economy is forecast to contract by 9.4 in this year. After the rebound in the third quarter, GDP is expected to drop again in the fourth quarter due to the new restrictions. The high level of stringency is set to persist over the first quarter of next year, and the rebound is set to be partial in 2021 at 5.8. The National Recovery Plan will support the recovery, as in other countries. In Italy, real GDP is projected to fall by 9.9% this year and to rise by 4.1 and 2.8 in 21 and 22, close to the euro area average. Policy measures are set to continue supporting jobs and incomes, but are unlikely to prevent, unfortunately, a rise in unemployment. Spain has been one of the most affected countries by the pandemic. GDP is forecast to contract by 12.4% this year, reflecting the impact of the second wave, which hit Spain earlier than most EU countries. We project growth of 5.4%, so above average, in 21 and 4.8% in 22. Short-time work schemes have limited job losses, but unemployment is still projected to increase this year and next and to decline in 22. Let me finally add that GDP in the UK is expected to fall steeply in 2020 by 10.3%. It is then forecast to grow by 3.3% in 21 and by about 2% in 22. The move to the assumed WTO most favored nation trading relations between EU and UK, as from the beginning of 21, is expected to slow down the recovery. Again, I repeat, this is a technical assumption without any prejudice to the ongoing negotiations. Now, the budgetary outlook. The aggregate fiscal deficit is expected to surge from about 0.5% of GDP in 2019 to 8.5% in the EU and 8.7% in the euro area this year. This mainly reflects the collapse of growth and the sizable discretionary fiscal measures that have been deployed, and rightly so. In 2021, the deficit is forecast to ease to around 6% and 6.5% of GDP in the EU and euro area, under a no policy change assumption. This decrease reflects the expected unwinding of pandemic-related measures and the rebound in economic activity. The aggregate debt to GDP ratio is projected to reach 102% in the euro area this year and 94% in the EU, which is about 15 percentage points above the 2019 level. In both areas, it is expected to rise by the further 1 percentage point by 2022. The most severely hit euro area countries are forecast to reach double-digit deficit ratios in 2020, namely Belgium, France, Italy, and Spain. In 2021, the deficits are forecast to stay above 3% of GDP in all member states, except Cyprus, Luxembourg, Denmark, Croatia, and Sweden. The debt ratio is expected to increase in all member states in 2020 and to decrease in around a third of member states in 2021. Now, to the risks. Traditionally, we describe the risks to our forecast, and these risks are substantial. First, on the downside, the pandemic could become more severe and last longer. In such case, more stringent and protracted containment measures would be required next year, leading to lower growth and higher unemployment and leaving deeper scars on the corporate sector. As an open economy, the EU would be also affected if the global economy turns out weaker due to a longer or more severe pandemic at the global level. Supportive policy measures could be withdrawn prematurely. This concerns both fiscal policy support, in particular job retention schemes, but also health policy measures. There is then the risk that in spite of policy efforts, country divergence might become entrenched, endangering the functioning of the internal market. And lastly, the possibility of financial market stress, which is not there now, also cannot be excluded as a downside risk for the future. But let me end with a more optimistic message, because there are also a number of upside risks. First, faster medical advances could accelerate the relaxation of distancing measures, improve confidence, and result in a quicker return to normal. This, of course, includes the possibility of a swift and widespread deployment of a vaccine next year. And second, a future EU-UK trade agreement would mean a positive impact on economic activity from 2021 as compared to the forecast baseline of the UK and EU assumed to trade on WTO most favored nation terms. Lastly, let me say a few words on Next Generation EU, because our forecasts only take into account measures that are publicly announced and sufficiently detailed. We have not been able, in most cases, to include in our projections investment that could potentially be financed through Next Generation EU. Also, no financing from the RRF has been included on the revenue side of the budgetary projections. Only the 10% pre-financing of RRF grants is included in the forecast for 2021 as a financial transaction with an indirect debt-reducing impact. Next Generation EU is, of course, much more than an upside risk to our baseline. It represents an unprecedented boost to the EU economy. You will find in the forecast document an updated simulation of the substantial growth effects that can be expected, up to 2% of GDP on average, in the years of its active operation. Moreover, Next Generation EU will be a strong tool to counter the divergence between countries that I have mentioned, since the most of the countries hardest hit by the pandemic, according to our forecast, are also part of the group of member states receiving the largest grants contribution. For example, Croatia, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and Greece. So it's essential that we see a swift agreement in the ongoing negotiation on Next Generation EU, so that this game-changing program of investment and reform can get underway and start supporting the recovery and transformation of our economies. Thank you, and now I'm ready for your questions.